And so for a very long time, materialism or naturalism, this idea that the world is just made up of matter and there is no spiritual dimension to it, really didn't have a story. Okay, till you get to the middle of the 19th century and the advent of the origin of the species, right? So Darwin writes The Origin of the Species, and then a little bit later he writes The Descent of Man. And what Darwin provided for materialism was a story. Okay, so up till then it didn't really have a story. It didn't have an explanation of how things began and where they're going. But this is one of the reasons why Darwinism was so powerful and caught on so powerfully towards the latter part of the 19th century, because it provided for materialists and naturalists, it provided for them a story, okay, that they didn't have previously. So Richard Dawkins, the famous biologist from Oxford and very militant atheism, he says about Darwinism, he says it made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Okay, so the idea is, we didn't have a story up to this point, but now we've got a story. We can explain how all these things happened. Okay? Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So last week we finished up our whole section on where we were covering all kinds of issues related to philosophical questions, and we've covered everything from the existence of God and the nature of humanness and the problem of evil and that sort of thing. Okay, so now we want to move on into our next section. We'll be in for the next few weeks, in which we're going to be talking about worldviews, and I've got listed there several resources for you. The first two are just regular books, very easy to read and understand. Abdu Murray, I think I've mentioned him before, is a converted Muslim, came to Christ, and he's written his book, Grand Central Question, which deals with the issue of worldviews, and he looks at, I think, as I recall, 4 different worldviews and examines them in some detail. Then James Sire's book, The Universe Next Door, is a book all about worldviews, very helpful book, and I'll be referring to him some more as we go on today. Then Winfried Corduran has written a book, Neighboring Faiths, and it's basically an encyclopedia of religions. It's just a tremendous resource. It's a big book, and it just covers in detail a number of different religions. So if you're interested in having a resource in your library on all kinds of different faiths, and he looks not just at kind of the general category like Islam or Hinduism, but he breaks it down. He looks at all the various different divisions and sects and that sort of thing within these various religions. So it's a very thorough, very informative book written from a Christian perspective. And then, I don't know if I've mentioned this book before, but I will from time to time, the Baker Encyclopedia of Christian Apologetics. And that book is just what it says. It's an encyclopedia basically of just all kinds of topics related to the question of Christian apologetics. And so if you have no other book on apologetics in your library, this is the book to have, because it has articles on just almost any question you'll confront or come up against. Of course, not as in-depth as a complete book on the subject might be, but it's just a tremendous resource. And he has, of course, a section on worldviews in his encyclopedia. So those are some resources. So about 20 years ago or so, I remember just beginning to encounter this term, worldviews. Okay, it just hadn't been around much, and I began, when I was reading Christian authors or whatever, or listening to Christian speakers, they'd use this term, worldview, and you know, the term in some ways kind of sounds self-explanatory, but on the other hand, I just wasn't sure what they meant because it was just kind of such a new term. And actually, the interesting thing is that even today, on my computer, when I type the word worldview in, it always gets flagged, you know, as a misspelled word, because even today, it's particularly in a more general culture, it's just not something people think about. Okay, although within the Christian environment, there's been a great deal of thought given to it in the last 20 years or so. So the question is, what is a worldview? That was the question I kept asking myself. I kept coming across this term when I'd be reading in a book or something, and somebody just throw it out there like we knew what it was, you know. And I kept asking myself, what exactly do you mean by that? Well, Sire gives a definition in his book. He calls it a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions, assumptions which may be true, partially true, or entirely false, that we hold consciously or subconsciously, consistently or inconsistently, about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation upon which we live and move and have our being. So that's kind of a mouthful for a definition. So let's go through and let's think about several parts of his definition. So he calls the worldview a commitment. So while a worldview involves our ideas and our thoughts, how we think mentally about things or intellectually about things, it really is, it's more than just our ideas. As he points out, it's an orientation of the heart. So it's really how we are spiritually oriented. So it's not just how do I think about, as far as just what are my ideas or my propositions, so to speak, about reality, but what is the inclination of my heart? How do I feel about these things? And what is my natural, just kind of, if you want to use this term, what is my kind of gut response to the reality that's around me, whatever that reality might be? And it's a perspective then, and as I say, more than just an intellectual perspective, but it's a perspective on just the whole of life that just profoundly influences everything we do. It influences how we make decisions, how we relate to people, how we think about the world about us, how we respond to things. It just profoundly affects all areas of our life. Then in his definition he goes on, he says that can be expressed as a story or a set of presuppositions. So oftentimes a person's worldview will be shaped by some kind of what we might call a story or a narrative. And when I say story, I don't mean a fictional story. It may be fictional, it may not be fictional, but it's just kind of the grand story. Oftentimes we might even think of it as a history that we think of that shapes our whole view of reality. Okay? So it's an understanding of where we came from. It's kind of the story of where we came from and where we're going and that sort of thing. So, of course, for the Christian, our worldview ideally would be shaped by the redemptive story. So starting with God and the creation, and down through the history of the Scriptures, or the history that the Scriptures give to us, through the story of Christ, and then on even as far as its prophecies concerning the future. So we could think of the scriptural story as kind of our grand story that shapes our worldview, so to speak. So it can be expressed as a story, and then our individual lives, our individual story fits somehow into that grand story, and that's how we understand how we relate to reality. We think of our of our lives as part of this grand story, maybe just a tiny part, but still a part of the story. But you can have a worldview without a story, okay? You can have a worldview which just really is made up of, as he says, a set of presuppositions, or we might call them axiomatic beliefs, or just certain things that a person believes without having a story. And in my mind, when I think of that, I think of naturalism or materialism as a worldview before the 19th century. So, for example, I've got up there the Enlightenment. So during the French Enlightenment, particularly the French aspect of the Enlightenment, there was kind of a wholesale rejection of Christianity by the Enlightenment thinkers and the French philosophes and Voltaire and other guys like that, who basically repudiated the Christian faith, repudiated the Christian worldview, but they had a set of ideas that they held to. And particularly when you get to the French Revolution, those ideas got expressed in the mantra liberty, equality, and fraternity. And this was supposedly one of the chief mantras of the French Revolution. But you see what's being communicated there is not so much a story as specific axioms or propositions or presuppositions about the value of liberty and the value of equality and the value of brotherhood or fraternity. Okay, and so for a very long time, materialism or naturalism, this idea that the world is just made up of matter and there is no spiritual dimension to it, really didn't have a story. Okay, till you get to the middle of the 19th century and the advent of the origin of the species, right? So Darwin writes The Origin of the Species, and then a little bit later he writes The Descent of Man. And what Darwin provided for materialism was a story. Okay, so up till then, it didn't really have a story. It didn't have an explanation of how things began and where they're going. But this is one of the reasons why Darwinism was so powerful and caught on so powerfully towards the latter part of the 19th century, because it provided for materialists and naturalists, it provided for them a story, okay, that they didn't have previously. So Richard Dawkins, the famous biologist from Oxford and very militant atheism, he says about Darwinism, he says it made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Okay, so the idea is, we didn't have a story up to this point, but now we've got a story. We can explain how all these things happened. Okay, so going on then with our definition, Sire says assumptions which may be true, partially true, or false. So a person's worldview may be largely true or entirely true, theoretically. I don't know if anybody's worldview is perfectly, absolutely true, or partially true, and I would suggest that probably almost all worldviews have some element of truth in them, or otherwise they wouldn't be believable to most people, or they could just be theoretically false. Okay? And then he says that we hold consciously or subconsciously. I think I have in your notes there consciously or unconsciously. It's probably better to say subconsciously than unconsciously. So it's possible for someone to have a worldview. Maybe they were born and raised in that worldview, or maybe they came to that worldview later in life. But it's one that they've thought very carefully about. They've thought very carefully through it. So they're very conscious that they have a worldview, and they're very aware of what that worldview is and why they believe it and its strengths and weaknesses and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, I would suggest, I've never taken a survey, so I couldn't tell you, but I would suggest that probably most people in the world have a worldview they never think about. Okay, it's just, they just kind of live in the world from day to day, just getting on, doing what they have to do to survive. And they don't really think about the fact that they have a worldview, but everybody does. Okay, so it's possible to have one and be very conscious of it, or to have one and have it really kind of control and directing your life subconsciously. I think about this a lot I've been thinking about over the last few years and fact, I just downloaded a book on Kindle this week that I started reading, helping me explore this area of how our subconscious worldviews affect things that we do and things that we say, how we vote, how we think about social issues and that sort of thing. Because what I see happening a lot, I think, with people is they're thinking about, particularly thinking now about social issues and political issues, and they're just kind of thinking from the gut, and they don't really realize how their worldview is directing their thoughts and their reactions, how they vote, what issues they support, what issues they oppose, and so they're really not aware of what's driving them, and I think that's true even probably oftentimes with many Christians. So what I want to do is I want to learn, I want to grow, I want to understand what is my worldview, what are the things I really believe, and if I really believe those things, then how does that influence how I think about various things and how I vote and how I act and that sort of thing. So it's just a very important, I think, very interesting thing to think about. And then he says that we may hold consistently or inconsistently. And when I think about this issue of consistency and inconsistency, I think about two things. One is your worldview itself, your set of ideas and thoughts that you have about things, can be, within that set of ideas, can be fairly consistent, or there can be some significant inconsistencies or kind of glaring inconsistencies. So, for example, you may have someone who's a materialist or a naturalist, and so they believe that everything is just matter and the results of the laws of nature and chemistry and physics and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, they may hold a very high view of the value of humans, right? Well, in one sense, that's kind of there's an inconsistency, there's a conflict between those two ideas, and somebody may hold both those ideas at the same time, right? So it's possible that your worldview itself may be either fairly consistent or have some significant inconsistencies in it. Or the other way that you can see this kind of consistency, inconsistency, is in how we live out our worldview. So I may have a worldview that says that, well, I ought to live this way or think this way or act this way, but actually I'm not doing that. I'm not living according to my worldview. So this matter of consistency relates both to the subject, or the thoughts, I should say, the ideas of my worldview, and also relates to the question of how do I live in relationship to my worldview? Am I consistent in how I live out what I believe to be my worldview? Now, when you talk about worldviews, one of the things we need to think about is oftentimes we kind of categorize people in kind of broad categories. So we may talk about a theistic worldview or an atheistic worldview or an Islamic worldview or whatever. We may talk about various different worldviews, but within kind of a general, what we might think of as a general worldview, there's a great deal of variety. So not all the adherents to a particular general worldview would agree at every point, right? So, for example, think about theism. So you might talk about theism as a general worldview. Somebody might say somebody has a theistic worldview. Well, what does that mean? Certainly that the idea that there is a monotheistic God across all the people who think in a theistic sense would make us very agreeable, very similar on a number of points, but there are a number of points in which we would differ. So under the kind of general category of a theistic worldview, you could have a Jew, you could have a Christian, you could have a Muslim, you could have a Zoroastrian, so you could have a number of different people with really widely different worldviews that kind of fit together in a general category. And even when you get down narrower, so if you say, well, this person has a Christian worldview. Well, what does that mean? Are they are they a theological liberal? Are they a Southern Baptist? Are they a Russian Orthodox? Are they Catholic? Okay, those things change how you view reality to one degree or another. Of course, the difference, say, between a Southern Baptist and a Catholic is not going to be as much as the difference between, say, a Southern Baptist and a Muslim. Okay, so one of the things we just have to be very cognizant of is this variety that you get within various worldviews, and then the other thing we have to be cognizant of is this idea of folk religions. Okay. Now, as you'll see here in a minute, worldview involves more than our religion, but certainly religion plays a significant role in it. And one of the things you run into is this whole issue of folk religion. So this plays a role in what shapes a person's worldview. So you might think of say, here in America, we have most people kind of were raised on kind of a roughly so-called Christian worldview, but for many of them, their Christianity is just kind of a cultural Christianity. Okay, so they celebrate Christmas, they celebrate Easter, and that sort of thing, but really their religion is kind of more of a cultural thing they do than a really deep-seated spiritual thing. So they don't really adhere or follow so much that they're not concerned about the particular doctrines of the religion. They don't necessarily follow the kind of the official practices of the religion, so to speak, on any kind of a real faithful, regular basis. But their religion is just kind of a folk religion, all right? And so this, of course, would create a variety within the worldview. So what this means, the implication of this whole idea of variety, is that when I'm talking to someone, so I'm out in the park or whatever, and I strike up a conversation with somebody, and I find out the person is, say, a Muslim, okay? And so I begin to talk with them and interact with them, and maybe if I get the chance to begin to share with them maybe a little bit. I need to be careful about just thinking, oh, this person's a Muslim, I know what Muslims think. Okay, I know what the Muslim worldview is. We're going to spend here in a few weeks, we're going to spend a couple weeks on the Islamic faith, okay? But it would be counterproductive if after having spent a couple weeks on it, and then I think when I sit down with a Muslim, I'm going to know exactly what he thinks, right? Because there's this factor of variety. So you have all this variety among Muslims, and they think differently. So what this means is when I encounter someone and I know what kind of general worldview they're coming from, that doesn't mean I really know what they think about everything. And so I have to be careful to listen. I have to listen to what the person says and not presume that I know what they think, that I know really all the dimensions of their worldview. So just keeping that in mind, that even if I know kind of the general category that somebody operates in, that doesn't mean that I really fully understand them until I've heard them, until they've told me, this is what I believe. No, I don't believe that, or no, you don't quite have the nuance of it right, of what I believe. So we really just need to be careful to listen to people. So the other question we might ask is, why do we even need to think about this? Why do we need to think about worldviews? And there are several reasons, and of course one is, as we've already mentioned, our worldviews just profoundly influence how we live our lives. They allow us, as Sire says, they allow us to think coherently. So everybody thinks according to their worldview, whatever their worldview is. And again, they may hold their worldview subconsciously, but that's still how they view reality. And so in all their experiences of life, they interpret it according to that worldview. And our worldviews, to one degree or another, affect how we conduct ourselves in our personal lives and in our relationships with others. So how I live my life is affected by my perception of what reality is, and how I relate to other people, how I relate to my neighbor, how I relate to people at work, how I relate to my wife, how I relate to my children. All those things are influenced by my worldview. And then they, of course, influence our whole just perception of reality. So just my understanding of the material world. What is the material world? And my understanding of history. So when I think back on things that happened in the past, we see this so graphically illustrated right now today in American culture. Is there's a radical rethinking of American history. And that radical rethinking of American history grows out of a worldview. So it's not that the history is driving the worldview, it's that the worldview is driving the history. So, for example, the whole thing with the 1619 Project, that whole perception and understanding of history is being driven by the worldview of the people who are writing the 1619 Project and publishing it. And so, but just like our worldview helps us understand the past and put it in some kind of framework, it also helps us understand the future. Where am I going? Where is this whole thing going? So for me as a Christian, I have a particular perception of the future and what the future holds. For me personally and also for the world in general, for all of reality. The atheist, the materialist on the other side, he also has an anticipation of the future. He has some thoughts about where things are going and what the future holds. That's all shaped by our worldview. And then, of course, our worldview shapes our understanding of the transcendent. Right? So what I mean by the transcendent is that which transcends the material world and the world that I rub shoulders with and I have contact with. Okay, so is there anything that transcends that? And if there is something that transcends that, what is that or who is that? Okay, so my worldview shapes that. So worldviews are just incredibly important. Now, so I've talked about adopting worldviews, talking about people about worldviews. So actually what I'm implying in all of this is that it's possible for our worldviews to be shaped or molded. So the question is, how did I get to where I am? Yeah. What shaped my worldview to get me to this point where I hold the worldview that I have? And Sire argues that worldviews are primarily shaped by our religious or our spiritual views or our metaphysical views. Okay. So the primary thing that in my life, in my experience, the primary thing that shaped my worldview is my Christian faith. Okay, and the way I grew up, how I grew up, how I was trained in the Christian faith, all that sort of thing. This was a primary factor in shaping my worldview. And this is true even for a person who's not a religious person. A person who isn't religious still has a spiritual view, right? Or they have what we might call a metaphysical view, all right? And it's that spiritual view, whether it's a view that says there is no such thing as spirit, or if it's a spiritual view that says the world is all material and natural and that's all it is, that is still a metaphysical view, all right? And it's that religious or spiritual or metaphysical view that is the primary shaper for many people of their worldview. And then the second thing that shapes our worldview is a culture or the environment or the milieu in which we grew up and in which we live, right? So these two things are what really shape our worldview. And so let's think for a minute then some of the implications this has for this whole idea of a Christian worldview. So think about the Old Testament characters. Think about Abraham or David or some of those guys back in the Old Testament. Okay? And we might ask ourselves, did they have a biblical worldview? Okay? Did Abraham have a biblical worldview? Well, you know, I think I'd probably be inclined to say, yeah, I think Abraham had a biblical worldview, right? But what does that mean? Because Abraham lived in a radically different culture than I lived in, right? So he lived in this agricultural economy. He was a nomad. He lived in this tribal, patriarchal society. So society wasn't structured like society is today, but was structured around the family and the tribe and the clan, and the hierarchy was centered on the patriarch. Just a radically different way of the structure of society than the way we look at it today, right? And this shaped how Abraham viewed reality. And one of the ways this manifests itself when we're reading through the story of Abraham is when God speaks to Abraham, God employs cultural phenomena that Abraham was familiar with, right? And he uses those to try to help Abraham understand things about himself, about God, and about their relationship and that sort of thing, right? And when God does that with Abraham, some of those things just go right over our heads, right? So, for example, the example I like to use, because it's kind of the most graphic example, is the story with Abraham there in Genesis 15, where he falls asleep and he has a dream, and he has this dream where these animals have been cut in half, okay? And they're laying in the mutilated carcasses of these animals are laying, you know, the pieces opposite each other, and there's this passageway, this bloody passageway in between, and then there's this lamp that passes down, and Abraham's having this dream or this vision, right? And when we read that as 21st century American Christians, it's just gross. The story is just a gross, inexplicable, you know, what's going on. But it was perfectly understandable to Abraham. Why? Because what was happening there in his dream was a cultural thing that God was using to help Abraham understand about the covenant relationship between God and Abraham, right? So the only way we as 21st century Christians can understand that is if we go back and study the culture and figure out what was going on in the culture, so we can figure out what in the world was God trying to say to Abraham in that dream, right? So Abraham has what I would say was a biblical worldview, but his worldview was not only shaped by his beliefs about God, but also about his culture. All right? So he viewed culture, and he viewed society, and he viewed his relationship with society really different in many ways than I do, because he was a patriarch, he was a nomad, and all that sort of thing. So in contrast, today we live in a democratic society. This whole thing about tribes and clans and patriarchs, that's all long gone. We don't think in those terms anymore. So we live in this kind of democratically structured society, highly urbanized, highly scientific, advanced scientific concepts and ideas. So when I think about the world, I think in scientific concepts that Abraham had no clue of, right? And so my worldview is in significant ways different than Abraham's. So then the question comes up, what makes a worldview a biblical worldview, right? And what I think we need to ask ourselves is if I'm going to have a biblical worldview, does that mean I have to adopt the entire perspective of Abraham or David or Daniel or whatever, right? So do I need to somehow kind of immerse myself in that culture? When I was younger here in Norman, I was very active on the university campus, doing a lot of evangelism and things like that. I had the church I was with, our primary focus was on the college campus, and there was a group. There was kind of this kind of nomadic group of Christians. They professed to be Christians anyway, who would travel around to various campuses and they would preach and do that sort of thing. And they came to Norman several times, or 2 or 3 times that I remember. But we called them the the robe people because they dressed just like Jesus dressed, okay, or like they thought Jesus dressed. So they all wore white robes, and they shunned owning motor vehicles and that sort of thing, although they wouldn't hesitate to hitchhike or whatever. But they shunned owning property because Jesus didn't own property and that sort of thing. Is that a biblical worldview? Is that what we're called to do? Are we called to just kind of shed the whole modern culture and go back out in the woods and live in the woods and that sort of thing, you see? Or is a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview, is it a worldview that is profoundly shaped by the meaning of Scripture, the truths of Scripture, the message of Scripture, as it applies in our culture today, all right? And I would suggest that it's the latter. What we want to do is we want to understand what God was saying back then, and that, to some degree, like the example I just used, means to some degree we need to figure out what was the culture like back then so we can understand the historical context, the cultural context in which God was speaking, so we can understand what He was saying to Abraham, what He was saying to David, what He was saying to Paul, okay? We want to understand that cultural context to get the message of Scripture, and then we have to figure out how does that relate to the world that I live in today and the culture that I live in today. So what that calls me to do, and I struggle with this, actually the longer I live, the more I wrestle with this issue, okay? And that's the question of, at what points are my cultural views, and sometimes it's just hard to figure out what are my cultural views and what are my truly biblical views, okay? But to think about my cultural views, which one of the things that I adopt from my culture and just absorb from my culture and which influence the way I think, which ones of those things are actually biblically supported? You know, are they justified by Scripture? And which ones of the things that I have just kind of absorbed from my culture are things that really Scripture speaks against, right? And then what are the things that I've absorbed from my culture and that affect how I think? How many of those things are just kind of neutral? You know, the Scripture doesn't speak one way or another. And this is something that, like I say, just in the last few years for me, I've just been thinking more about and praying more about, because it's very, very, very difficult. If you've tried it, I'm sure you know this is true. It's very difficult to wrestle through the questions of, what do I believe because the Bible teaches me, and what do I believe because this is just the culture I live in, right? And as we see, there's just tremendous variety. So one of the things I think about a lot of times, oftentimes, is I think about how I just view life from the context of how I grew up, the family I grew up, the parents I had, what we did as a family, okay? And then I look at somebody else and I just assume they're seeing everything the same way I'm seeing it. And then I stop and think, well, wait a minute, they grew up in a different family. They had different parents. They had a totally different experience growing up. They had certain things culturally the same. They probably celebrated Christmas and went to a public school and, you know, whatever, you know. So there were probably some things that they... But the fact is, my children have a different worldview than I have. Because my children, for better or worse, grew up with Mary and me as their parents. And I grew up with Joyce and Fred as my parents, right? And so I had totally different parents who parented differently than I parent. Even if I tried to imitate their parenting, you know, I wouldn't have done it successfully. So my children in some ways see reality different than I see reality. And you know, by this time in my life, my children are adults, they're, you know, and having their own children, and it's very clear that although they love the Lord and they're committed to the Christian faith, they have a different perception of reality. They grew up in a different time. They grew up with different influences. They grew up with computers and cell phones and all that sort of thing. And I grew up in the days of newspapers and comic books, you know. And so it's just... So what we have to do then is we have to think through our worldviews. If we want to be mature Christians, we have to think through our worldviews and go, okay, how much is culture having a positive effect on my outlook, and how much is culture having a negative effect on my outlook? As I think about all kinds of things, how I relate to the world. So thinking more then about this idea of how our worldviews are shaped, all of this implies that worldviews are in flux. Okay, and for different people, probably there's different amounts of change that happen to our worldviews, but probably everybody's worldview is to some degree in flux. They're not set in concrete. So I didn't get a worldview when I was born, or when I was, reached adulthood, or maybe when I came to Christ or whatever. That didn't set my worldview in concrete, so to speak, but they're actually changing over time and developing. And in fact, a worldview can be completely exchanged. You can exchange one worldview for another worldview. Now, most people obviously don't do that, but it is possible for that to happen. So you might have someone who perhaps grew up in, say, Iran, and they were a Muslim, and at some point maybe they traveled to the West and maybe encountered some Christian and they became converted. And so there would be just a radical shift in their worldview. They'd have a completely different worldview. So what are the kinds of things then that cause change in our worldview, or that cause this kind of flux in our worldview? And of course, one of the primary things that changes our worldview is just the things that are around us, the influences that are around us, and then also maybe just reading books and discovering various things that I didn't know before, learning truths I didn't know before, or hearing something that's really not false, and I fall into the trap of believing it, and it can alter my worldview. Another profound influence on people's worldviews is, what we call the shrinking world. So, of course, the world isn't actually physically shrinking, but as far as our rubbing shoulders with other people in the world, we just do much, much more of that than we used to in the past. So things like modern transportation, the fact that you can get on an airplane and in a few hours you can be in China, or you can be in the Middle East, or you can be in Russia, or you can be in Europe, or you can be in South America. And so that gives you exposure to other worldviews that you wouldn't have. And then, of course, the whole thing with information technology. So first, of course, was things like the development of radio and television, and that profoundly, radically began to change people's worldviews on certain things. And of course, back in the 16th century, the development of the printing press had a profound impact on people's worldviews. It was a major moving factor in the Protestant Reformation that radically changed how Europe viewed reality. And then, of course, we get into modern things like computers and iPhones and that sort of thing. So just through social media and texting and that sort of thing, you have exposure to other ideas, and those tend to shape our worldviews. And then, of course, there's just kind of major population movements, which mean that we have exposure to other ideas. So just tourism. There's just so much more tourism today than there was in decades and centuries past. And so people travel and they get exposure to other ideas and other cultures, and this influences how they think about reality. There's immigration. So I have the opportunity, having a son-in-law who has immigrated from Africa, and he brings some of his ideas to him, and they get introduced into our family, and it helps shape our perspective of a family, of reality. There's, of course, refugee movements that have a profound influence. So the whole worldview of Europe is shifting radically today as we speak, in part because of the refugee movement of Muslims moving into Europe, and it's radically changing the population dynamic of Europe and the way Europe thinks about reality, right? So refugee movements have a significant influence. These are all things that influence or shape shape our view of reality. So, what are some worldviews? These are just a few, and we'll be looking at some of these over the next few weeks. Theism, of course, is a kind of a general worldview, basically monotheistic. And under theism, you would have the biblical worldviews of Judaism and Christianity. And then also a theistic worldview would be, another one would be Islam, would be a major theistic worldview. And then you have deism. So next week we're going to talk about theism as a general worldview, and we're going to talk about deism and what's the difference between theism and deism. There's, of course, atheism, or we might think of it as naturalism, and continuity. And continuity is just kind of a general category I use to categorize several things. One is pantheism. Another would be what we think of as, what's thought of as monism, and even polytheism. So polytheists, of course, believe in many gods, but they have this element, this kind of shared element of continuity that we'll talk about here in a few weeks. And then there's animism, the whole idea that the material world is invested with this kind of spiritual dimension or spiritual reality. These are all various worldviews that you are very likely or very possibly will encounter as you just rub shoulders with people, even right here in Norman, Oklahoma, right? It's very likely that you could have interaction with people in any one of these groups, as diverse as they are, and as kind of monolithic as Oklahoma sometimes seems it is, it's still possible to run into those. So why do we want to think about worldviews then? Well, one is, if you understand a person's worldview, then you're in a better place just to understand them, to care about them, to have compassion. Even if you don't agree with them, if you understand how they think, you can be more thoughtful, more considerate, more compassionate in how you talk to them. And if you understand a person's worldview, you're in a better place to understand what are the obstacles to faith? What are the obstacles to the Christian faith that they face? And I like to use the example of say, an atheist and a Muslim. Say at one time you're talking to a person, and this person's an atheist, and you're sharing with them about the resurrection, and they give you pushback against the idea of the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, and then a few days later you're talking to a Muslim, and you start talking to them about the resurrection of Jesus, and they're giving you pushback. So both of them, the atheist and the Muslim, are rejecting the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. But if you understand the worldview from which they're coming, you'll know that they're rejecting the resurrection for entirely different reasons. They have entirely different obstacles. To the atheist, the resurrection of Jesus is a physical impossibility because it goes against the laws of nature. That's why he pushes back. The Muslim has no problem with miracles. He has no problem at all with the idea that God could raise somebody from the dead. That's not a problem. His problem lies in the fact that he doesn't believe Jesus died. Okay? So he has an entirely different reason why he objects to the resurrection. But if you don't understand those differences in worldview, and you're talking to somebody about the resurrection and they're giving you pushback, you may not know how to help them with their questions and with their objections. And the same thing would be true, so for example, with a Hindu and a materialist, they're going to have totally different ideas about material reality. Okay? So the materialist is going to see material reality in one light, and the Hindu is very likely to see the material world as just simply an illusion, right? So just totally different ways of thinking about things. So if we understand worldviews, it will help us answer people's questions better. And then, of course, as we learn about other worldviews, it helps us to just think about our own, because we can look at ours in comparison to others, and so it can help us to just refine and develop our own worldview so it's clearer and so it's better understood. It helps us to ask, why do I believe what I do? I just believe what I believe because I was taught to believe that, and that doesn't mean it's not true, but do I really have good, solid reasons to believe it? And this thinking about worldviews helps us to do that, and it can also help us be more consistent. When we see where somebody else is maybe being inconsistent in their worldview, that may help us think about my own consistency. How consistent is my worldview, and how consistent am I being in living according to it? And then also it just helps us to define our worldview more carefully, more precisely. As we think about somebody else's worldview, and we know our worldview really doesn't match that worldview, but why doesn't it match? Sometimes we have trouble thinking about, well, what's the difference? Because we haven't really defined our worldview carefully. So it can help us to be more definitive about our worldview. So the question then is, when I look at a worldview, how can I figure it out? How can I know what somebody's worldview is, or what a worldview holds? And there are a couple different approaches. The primary way to do it is by simply asking questions of the worldview. And when I say that, I mean either studying the worldview, reading about the worldview, or talking to somebody who has that worldview and asking these kinds of questions. And Abdu Murray, in his book, Grand Central Questions, or Grand Central Question, he lists 4 questions that he uses when he thinks about a worldview. And he takes several, I think he takes, like I said, 4 different worldviews, and he asks these 4 different questions of these worldviews. James Sire does the same type of thing in his book, but he has 8 questions that he uses. So he's a little more in-depth and a little more precise in how he approaches it. So Murray's 4 questions are: what explains existence? So you're just asking the worldview, so you're asking the person, or in your reading about the worldview, you're asking this question: what explains existence? Why do things exist? Okay. Then 2, is there an objective value and purpose to human existence? And if there is, what is that value and what is that purpose? Number 3, what accounts for the human condition? Like we've been talking about the last 3 weeks, how do you explain the problem of suffering and evil and that sort of thing? And then the 4th question is there a better life or salvation from our present condition? Okay, so those are 4 questions that Murray asks. Sire has, like I said, 8 questions. I'm just going to go through these very quickly. What is prime reality? What is really real? What is the source of all other reality? Where does reality come from? So what is the ultimate reality or prime reality? So this is really, as he says, the most fundamental question. This is the one that is the basis for how we answer all the other questions. So is ultimate reality, is it God? Is it the cosmos? Is it Brahma? What is it? His second question is, what is the nature of external reality? So the world around me, what is the nature of it? Is it matter? Is it spirit? Is it a mixture of matter and spirit? Is it eternal? Is it temporal? Those are all questions that worldviews have to address. What is a human being? Is he a god? Is he material, just matter only, just a kind of a machine? Or is there some kind of immaterial aspect to a human being? Are humans just the product of chance, or are they images of God? What happens to a person at death? Is he simply annihilated? Is he reincarnated? Is there some kind of continuation of the person after death? So their body dies and decays, but is there some way in which the person continues? And all the worldviews have to deal with these same questions, and so these are questions we can ask. Why is it possible to know anything at all? So this is the whole idea of where does rationality come from, and is it real? Is it simply an accident of evolution? And if it is an accident, how do you get rationality from accidents? Is it sourced in some kind of a rational being, a God or something like that? How do we know right from wrong? Is there such a thing as right and wrong? What is the source of morality? Is morality objective or subjective? His 7th question then is, what is the meaning of human history? So does human history have a meaning? And if it does, what is it? What is the purpose behind history? And then his 8th eighth question is, and one other question about history, is it linear or circular? And we'll talk more about that in a coming lesson. So then his eighth question is, given your answer to the first 7 questions, what bearing does that have on your life? So what are the core commitments or the obligations or duties that grow out of your answer to those first 7 questions? So those are his questions that he employs when he's assessing a worldview, trying to figure out a worldview. And so that's one approach you can take. Now, the other question is, what's your worldview? You know? And so to help you work through and think about your own worldview, let me just hand out these. This is a little bit of homework for this week. What I'd encourage you to do is to think through those questions on that sheet there and just answer them, just simply. Obviously I didn't give you much space there. Just answer them as best you can. And if you can, think about, once you've given your answer, think about, is there some passage in Scripture I'm familiar with that communicates this, okay? I'm not going to ask you to hand these in or anything like that. We may interact a little bit on them next week. But I just want you to kind of take those. Basically, I'm taking Sire's questions is what I'm doing. And I'm encouraging you to think about, how do I think about each of these questions? And why do I think about these questions? And two, if, like I say, if you have a passage of Scripture that you think, well, that speaks to that idea or speaks to that, jot that reference down or whatever. So I'd encourage you to do that next week. And next week we're going to talk about the general category of theism and deism, so we can see what is the difference between a theistic and a deistic worldview. Okay? So that's your work for next week. All right?